Hello everyone, and thank you for listening to me today. I'll start off by saying I adore the Eustace Diamonds. There's something about Lady Eustace, particularly as a character, that I just find extremely fascinating. I mean, of course, we are meant to despise her, but what I find increasingly, and particularly upon rereading, is how much I admire her, and particularly her audacity. I like how in these chapters, in spite of the legal wranglings going on about the diamonds, she decides to wear them to Lady Glencora's party. And you can't, again, help but admire her desire to provoke and embarrass Lord Fawn. I think what's interesting too is that she's largely successful in thwarting the people trying to take the diamonds away from her in these chapters. I enjoyed the scene where she gets the better of Mr. Camperdown, who has come to her house, by the very simple tactic of running away. And I think one of the reasons she is successful, in part, is because generally her motives and behaviour is so sort of chaotic that her adversaries at the moment don't sort of struggle to know what she will do next, as she doesn't really know either. She has these sort of shifting motives and alliances at the moment, sometimes wanting the Fawn interest, sometimes falling back on her cousin Frank. She's able to sort of outmaneuver her adversaries, not by sort of doing anything particularly intricate or having any tactics, by utilising, perhaps to use a sort of modern phrase, her chaotic energy. I think what I also love about the Eustace Diamonds is how, like the other great writers of the 19th century, it's just enormous fun. One bit that made me laugh in the chapters for this week was Madame Goesler remarking that Lord Fawn is just the man to marry Lady Eustace, for he's always at his office or at the house, which sort of reminded me, perhaps oddly, of Pride and Prejudice and Mr. Collins and Charlotte Lucas. And of course, as Dr. Goodman said last week in our talk, the rags to riches story of Lady Eustace has a clear parallel in other Victorian works of the time, Thackeray's Vanity Fair, and perhaps the plot overall of something like Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone. I think, though, what makes Lizzie certainly different from someone like Becky Sharp, and one of the reasons Trollope's fiction overall endures so well, is how psychologically complicated his characters are. In the chapter A Yanthee's Soul, Trollope tells us that, after a fashion, she knew herself to be false and bad. And I posed the question last week in our talks about Lizzie, is she a sociopath? It would seem that although the term didn't really exist then, Trollope does have her exhibit many of the traits, the sort of shallowness, superficial charm, essentially quite ruthless and kind of emotionally unstable. So perhaps a couple of questions for our discussion groups, but I would propose, is Lizzie Eustace a sociopath? And I suppose conversely, does it matter if she is, or is it helpful for us to look at older texts with our modern eyes and put our own jargon on it in this manner? Similarly, what we might call this sort of psychological duality of character is present in other figures in the book too. In the chapter, I Have Nothing to Give, we get a little insight into the psychological underpinnings of Frank Greystock, Lizzie's cousin. There are human beings who, though of necessity single in body, are dual in character, in whose breast not only is evil always fighting good against good, but whom evil is sometimes horribly, hideously evil, but is sometimes also not hideous at all. I wondered what people thought about Frank, particularly coming off the back of our discussions of Adolphus Crosby and the Small House at Allington. I think Trollope really is a master of highlighting the sort of essential tension for men of his time, man of his class, to maintain a sort of chivalric male identity that kind of comes into constant conflict with more modern notions of ambition and progress. And I think that the Eustace Diamonds too has a couple of other interesting parts to it that separate it from other works of Trollope. Firstly, I'd say in this book, perhaps unlike any of his other works, the role of servants is much more prominent here. We have Lucy Morris in the notoriously socially kind of ambiguous class of governess, as well as Andy Gowran up in Scotland and Lizzie's maid, Patience Crabstick, the last two introduced for the first time in these chapters. In The Yanthee's Soul, Trollope gives us a snapshot of what would be, to their employers at least, the perfect relationship. There are people, very fortunately circumstanced, whose servants, as a matter of course, know all their affairs, have an interest in their concerns, sympathise with their demands, feel their wants, and are absolutely at one with them. It's lamented by Trollope, perhaps with a slight wry smile, that Lizzie has no such servants to attend her. And I think what Trollope is trying to show us is that there is a certain fragility in this relationship, one that depends hugely on deference and trust to maintain it. I'm not entirely sure whether we were to take Andy Gowan's sort of insolence towards her in these chapters is more to do with the fact that Lizzie isn't truly a lady. Thus, it is Lizzie's sort of personality that threatens this delicate balance, rather than a critique of the relationship itself necessarily. I just thought this might be an interesting aspect for us to think about, as these relationships aren't really explored elsewhere in Trollope. And I had perhaps just one other thing to say about these chapters that we've read this week. In these chapters, we get the first glimpse of Scotland in the book, and indeed, outside of a few summer retreats in Phineas Finn, I think this is one of the only books that has a substantial proportion take place in Scotland. Personally, I find much of Andy Gowan's speech mostly sort of unintelligible. I appreciate what Trollope is trying to do here, but I think that overall it misses the mark, which is perhaps a similar problem I have with some of the Irish novels, incidentally. I wonder what other people thought about this. I think perhaps to our modern eyes, this sort of phonetic style of speech comes across maybe as a bit patronizing and maybe a bit demeaning. So perhaps apologies for the brevity, but I hope I've given us all a few things to think about for the discussion groups. And again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today.